Okay, well, we're about ready to start. If you could just turn your cell phones off, so hopefully your mind's on. Wow, this is great. This is far more than I was expecting. So I'm very pleased that you're here this morning. Can you hear me okay? Usually when I speak, I try to really enunciate, but if I do that too much, I'm going to lose my voice again. I lost it last week. I'm still getting over a flu. So hopefully, because I have to represent this evening as well. So hopefully you can hear me. If you can't, just let me know. But welcome. Right, we're here to learn a little bit more about Thomas Aquinas, one of the doctors of the church. Now I believe that there are, St. Francis has instituted a few more doctors of the church. I want to say now the number is at about 36 or 37 doctors of the church. A doctor of the church, there's some odd 10,000 or so. I mean, today we celebrate the saints, right? So there are some odd 10,000 or so official saints, official Catholic saints that have been recognized publicly as saints. But as you know, the saints fall into different categories. We have like virgins, we have apostles, we have martyrs, we have confessors. And there's a certain group called doctors of the church. And I want to say the number is at about 36 or 37, but I would have to check that again to see what Pope Francis has done. But a doctor of the church is someone who's, of course, not only lived a very holy life, but has also left behind him or her a very reliable body of teaching that is consistent with the Catholic faith. A reliable body of teaching. And Thomas Aquinas has been repeatedly affirmed as essentially the prince of doctors. That his teaching, especially in seminaries, especially the very language that a lot of our catechism uses, is Thomistic language. There are very few saints that popes have written entire encyclicals about. Thomas Aquinas has several encyclicals written on his thought alone. There you can find statements of multiple popes: Pope Pius, Pope Leo, Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict, constantly reaffirming that in seminaries and in catechism, the philosophy, the theology, and the spirituality of Thomas Aquinas must constantly be reaffirmed and take, and I quote, pride of place in teaching particularly philosophy and theology. So these are consistent statements that you'll find made about Thomas Aquinas. And so, before we getting into some of the intro and the meat of what I like to present, I just want to give you a rationale of why I'm doing this. That short of taking a seminary class or going to college, and unfortunately there are not many college courses on Thomas Aquinas anymore, we never hear about any of his philosophy, his theology, or his spirituality. And since I have studied it a fairly good bit, I figure, well, why not give it a try? I mean, if the church finds St. Thomas Aquinas so important, and I have some knowledge about him, then why should I not at least attempt to make that available in some way, shape, or form? So that is what I'm trying to do. That's all I'm trying to do. In particular, what we would call his psychology. understanding that word in a far deeper level than normal. The very foundations, the very powers, the very nature of the soul is what I mean to attempt to relay to you over the next several classes. Today just being an introduction. So let's begin with a prayer. Okay, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And Heavenly Father, we ask you for the grace of your Holy Spirit. Please clear our minds and our hearts, remove anything that is not of you, so that we might truly be able to receive some new gift of inspiration, some new gift of knowledge, to truly strengthen our spiritual lives so that we might join the saints whom we celebrate today. We also ask, we invoke the power and the protection of all the saints as we study one particular saint today, St. Thomas Aquinas, for your greater glory and for our greater sanctity. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay. Today, as I said, what I want to do is introduce some basics for you. Hopefully, it seems like everyone's here because the room is full. So that's good, because some of the things that I say from now on are going to be based on some of the knowledge that hopefully I'll relay to you today in class. Let me just tell you where I'm going. I want to tell you about Thomas Aquinas, because I think we don't know too much about his life, so I want to give you kind of a short homily on who he is, what he did, and introduce to you some basic terms from metaphysics. If you don't know what metaphysics is, I will hopefully tell you what metaphysics is. Gianna, do you remember what metaphysics is? Nope. I just told you what it was. Okay, I'll remind you what metaphysics is. Give you some terminology. What I'm trying to relay today in this class is certain. I can't give you an entire catechism on what the virtues are. I'm going to introduce to you the fact that according to the teaching of the Church, and certainly the teaching of Thomas Aquinas, the entire world, the world that God created, is absolutely well ordered. The soul united with the body that the Lord created is absolutely well ordered. Now sin disorders it, but in itself, in the way that it was created, our souls have a particular order. The world has a particular order. And as we try to understand our spiritual life, as we try to understand our emotional life, we should be confident that we have some solid ground to walk on. There are certain things within us that operate by certain rules. And there's a terminology that our church has given to understand what's going on in there. Okay, that's what I'm going to try to share with you over the next 4 classes, is how can I have some terminology to understand what's happening in there. Okay, and hopefully giving you some reliable terminology that the church gives us, okay, to help you do that. So that's what I want to relay to you today, to show you some of that order, to show you some of that terminology that Thomas Aquinas gives us. Now, Thomas Aquinas was born into a noble family in northern Italy in the year 1225. We actually think, rather than being Italian per se, Thomas Aquinas was probably a little bit more of a Germanic descent than he was of what we would say a typically Italian descent. Internally, like what was going on at the time, so we're talking about the middle 1200s, very important to understand the context of what has happened, or what was happening. Internally, the church was fighting the Albigensian movement. That's a kind of a $10 word. I wrote that up on the board. The Albigensian heresy. The Albigensians were dualists, which means that they believed in two separate gods, essentially. An evil God that made the material world, and a good God that was beyond the world. Now, what follows from that belief is that if the evil God made the material world, then how would you consider your body? Your body would be evil, wouldn't it? And that's what the Albigensians taught. What follows from this is that the flesh is evil, and God could not possibly become flesh because flesh was evil, so they rejected the core teaching of Jesus Christ, come in the flesh. Now, of course, they reject the church, they reject the sacraments, and they reject most authority, because all of those things are worldly. They're all material. They were fairly antisocial. They thought that marriage was evil. They thought the birth of children was evil, because it was evil to imprison a soul in flesh. That was a bad thing. Hopefully some of you are starting to pick up possibly some similarities between some thinking now and some thinking then. Okay. Among other things, they believed in reincarnation, and they refused to eat meat. There's a good bit of parallelism between the beliefs of the Albigensians and some of our modern disdain of the body. The Albigensian heresy was a true sense of loss of identity regarding God, the family, and the soul. And we can see the same kind of hatred of the body manifesting in our culture with abortion, euthanasia, and birth control. The movement became so powerful that internal crusades were actually launched against it. Crusades were not only launched against the Muslims, they were actually launched against some heretical groups that took over entire cities and sometimes entire countries. And the Albigensians was one of these crusades. Now, St. Thomas was born while these crusades were being launched. We need to understand that the Dominican order to which Thomas belonged was formed essentially to fight those errors. Therefore, the Dominican order embraces the material world, embraces creation, embraces the body, rather than disdaining it, and shows us instead how to rightly use the gifts of the material world, how to rightly view the body, rather than to simply reject it. This is the time that Thomas was born in, which is just important for us to realize. Now, externally, the church and state powers were still fighting for survival against Islamic forces that threatened its existence. It was a constant threat during these centuries that Islam might break into Europe and take over. Now, intellectually, possibly most importantly, we need to understand how significant it was that just as St. Thomas was entering school, the works of the great philosopher Aristotle were being translated into Latin. This is incredibly, incredibly important. Aristotle's work took the West by storm. It promised to provide natural explanations for reality that had never been known before. To try to get a sense of the intoxication of this new learning, just imagine being a university student in the sciences during the time that we just learned that the material world is made out of tiny particles called atoms and molecules. Imagine how exciting it would be to be a science student when we just figure that out. That would be a really big deal, wouldn't it? Okay, but Thomas was just entering school when all of these works on natural philosophy and metaphysics and ethics from Aristotle were being translated into Latin. So he was a student just as this intellectual storm hit. But see, some people love storms and some people don't. I love storms personally. I know some people like them, some people don't. Not everyone was happy about the work of Aristotle. There were many in the Catholic Church that held his work in high suspicion. Aristotle, for example, he taught that the world is eternal. In other words, that it was not created. For Aristotle, God is rather a distant mover of things, but not an intimate part of the very existence of things. God was not a personal God in the thought of Aristotle, and the soul does not continue any kind of relationship with the eternal after death in the work of Aristotle. So his work, according to some, seemed to invite a kind of atheism or agnosticism. So here's just try to imagine being in the church at this time. Aristotle, all this work is being translated. Some of it's quite exciting and promises to make sense of quite a lot, okay? But other parts of his work seem to threaten the very foundations of our belief. For these reasons, many church authorities sought to ban and condemn this newly translated work as novel, as dangerous, and as heretical. But when it came to ethics, natural philosophy, and metaphysics, Aristotle is a genius that has few rivals. And men like Thomas Aquinas could see that. He was determined to harmonize the thought of this Greek genius with the revelation of Christianity. And the church ultimately declared that the saint was successful in this endeavor. Okay, so what Thomas does is harmonize Christian dogma with Aristotelian philosophy. His entire life work was to put those two together. And ultimately, the church said he was so successful that our basic philosophy is his philosophy. But we have to realize that at his time, he was rather considered a radical. That was a bit radical what he was doing. Taking this newfangled Greek knowledge and trying to baptize it. Thomas was a bit of a rebel in his time. But ultimately, of course, the church blesses his work. Personally, St. Thomas Aquinas was a large, ponderous bull of a man. He was huge. If you look at some of his desks like in Rome and in other places, there's a large piece cut out of the front so that he could fit into it. Okay. That he was a big fellow. He was kind and quiet. He was so quiet that his classmates supposed that Thomas was rather dense. So they nicknamed him the Dumb Ox. That was his nickname, the Dumb Ox. One of the greatest geniuses who's ever lived. They thought he was dense. Okay. We know he liked herring. We don't know too many personal. Right before he died, apparently he asked the monks to bring him some herring. Now, if you get into heaven and God asks you a trivia question, what was Thomas Aquinas' favorite food? Go ahead and say herring. That might get you in. I don't know. Okay. Now, we certainly know that he loved his books. We know that he was a great poet because he wrote things like the Tantum Ergo. Tantum Ergo Sacramentum. That's Thomas Aquinas. In other words, he wasn't just a head. He had a lot of heart, too. He was very, very dedicated to the Eucharist, very dedicated to the Blessed Mother. Here's a fascinating thing. Thomas Aquinas has been consistently set up as the very model of speculative Orthodox thinking by the Roman Catholic Church for centuries. But again, I'd like to reiterate for us to understand how much of a rebel he was, at least in his time. He was doing something quite different. He embraced this new learning, and he was able to see it for the treasure that it was, despite many church authorities calling it heresy. Thomas Aquinas was himself called before the Inquisition, but he was vindicated, and he was able to defend himself. Now, second of all, Thomas was from a noble family. He could have easily had a life managing his family's estates, and instead he wanted to join this new radical order called the Dominicans, of all God-forsaken things. We still, of course, it's one of the greatest orders that's ever existed, right? The Dominicans. But now I took vows as a Benedictine. What we like to say is, fine, Thomas Aquinas didn't become a Benedictine, but he was taught by Benedictines. So there. Okay. Now, his family, which is true, his teachers were Benedictine. His family was so upset that he wanted to join this radical new order that fought the Albigensians, okay, that they essentially imprisoned him in the house for about a year. His brothers, who were Christian knights, even hired a prostitute to seduce Thomas, and he chased her away with a flaming log, threatened to hit her with it, okay, if she came any closer, okay. So he was pretty clear about where he wanted his life to head. He was a very pure fellow. He eventually got away, and he studied under St. Albert the Great, ultimately becoming a great teacher himself at the universities of Paris and at Naples. Now, on December the 6th, 1273, when Thomas was 48 years old, he was celebrating the community mass for his Dominican brothers and stopped during the consecration. He just was saying mass and just froze. And he froze there for quite a while. And his brothers tried to get his attention, but he would not budge. He eventually had to be ushered off the altar, and another one of his Dominican brothers finished the Mass. At the time, he was in the final stages of writing his masterpiece called the Summa Theologia, the sum of all theology. It was basically what it means in English. And he refused to dictate any more to his secretary Reginald, who begged Father Thomas to continue, understanding as he was dictating that the work was a masterpiece. Father Thomas's only response was this: "I can write no more. In comparison to the secrets that have been revealed to me, all that I have written seems like straw to me." Now, and he stopped writing at this point. On his way to the Council of Lyon, he became ill, which was made worse by striking his head on a low-hanging branch while he was riding on a donkey. He was riding a donkey. They didn't have access to horses all the time. And maybe the donkey was strong enough to carry Thomas, I don't know. But he died at a Cistercian abbey in Italy at the age of 49. I'm 49. Or what am I? No, I'm 40. Am I 48 or 49? I'm 48. Father Jack is 49. Just take a look at Father Jack. Put about 100 more pounds on him, and we have Thomas Aquinas. Okay? Now, he became sick. It's truly amazing to me that even while sick and dying, the monks gathered around his bedside and asked Thomas to give them a commentary on the Song of Songs. He's dying, but they realize that they have a master teacher with them, and they just won't leave him alone. They're just like, will you please teach us some more things? He died teaching, giving a profession of faith in the Holy Eucharist. That's how his final statement was on his absolute belief in the Holy Eucharist. Knowing that they had a saint with them, and this is a little macabre, they cut his head off Because they were afraid that the Dominicans would come and take the body, and they knew that they had the body of a saint. I love Catholics. We're so awesome. Okay, we're so weird sometimes. It's just like gloriously weird. But they wanted to have at least part of him, because again they realized how, pun intended, how massive of a saint they had in their midst, who shortly, within a century, was declared a saint and doctor of the church. By the time he died at the age of 49, Thomas had written some 60 large volumes of work in an age where writing was very difficult. Papyrus, paper, vellum, was incredibly difficult just to write, making him one of the most disciplined and prolific writers in the history of time before the computer age. His sense of personal discipline and organization had to have been truly superhuman. Because not only did he write a lot, but what he wrote, and you would have to study it to see it, is absolutely logically consistent. We're dealing, the stature of genius that we see in Thomas Aquinas is so reliable. What he probably did was dictate several different works to several different secretaries simultaneously. Being able to keep all of it organized in his head, There are no notepads, there are no sticky notes, there are no cell phones. He did all of this in his mind. And if you look at the structure of his work, it's all just, it's not stream of consciousness. It's all perfectly laid out, point by point by point. It's truly, well, we see the grace of God when we see the work of St. Thomas. So this class will be a basic review of some of his key concepts of the powers of the soul and the relation of those powers to the spiritual life. All of these concepts are accepted by the mainstream theology of the church. So, it's a bit of an intro. Now, I want to just talk to you about, 20 minutes or less. What is the nature of reality? Here we go. Metaphysics. Metaphysics, I can't stand it when I go to a bookstore and look at the section that says metaphysics. What do you normally see? When you go to a bookstore and you look at the metaphysics section, it's a lot of occult. That is not what metaphysics means. That is not its original meaning. But literally, metaphysics just means after the physics. Or it can kind of mean superphysics in a way. What metaphysics classically understood is supposed to be what is the very structure of reality itself. When you study metaphysics, you're trying to understand the nature of what exists. Just period. Other sciences are more specific, like biology, for example, studies living things that exist. Physics will study, things that exist so far as they are in motion. Psychology will the things that exist insofar as they are part of the human psyche. In other words, the different disciplines study different kind of aspects of what exists. But metaphysics studies what it means to exist, period. In other words, it's the most abstract science of all, which some people take to fairly well, and other people find it a little bit more difficult to think that abstractly. And I can only give you a few snapshots of this, so You'll please have to forgive me if I can't do that great of a job. Matter plus form equals substance. This is probably the key formula for Thomistic metaphysics. What does that mean? And these are some basic concepts that you would have to understand his entire project. Everything that is intelligible, in other words, everything that can be thought of, is in some way a substance, a thing. You see a substance. We experience substances. Everything that exists is a substance. Really, the definition of a substance would be something like something that exists in itself. Even if you were to think of, if you can think of something, it's probably a substance. Now, you might say, okay, well, what about an idea? What if I think about something like love? Well, can you picture that? What does love look like? I mean, in other words, whenever we think of pure ideas like justice or love, what we end up having to think of are things that are related to them. We think of just acts. We think of just people. We think of just laws. Ultimately, whenever the human being thinks or experiences reality, our reality is full of substances. It's full of things. Now, a substance is composed of two separate dimensions called matter and form. Now, you've probably, some of you have seen these terms or heard of these terms before. I'll try to explain them the best that I can. Matter is the stuff that things are made out of. Okay, for a lack of a more delicate way of saying it. Okay, matter is what exists throughout change. Let's take this podium. You know it's made of something. It's made of wood or whatever this is. Maybe it's wood, maybe it's plastic, but it's made out of some sort of stuff. Could this not be broken down and recreated into something else? Yes, it could be. What it is, its form is a podium. Its idea, what it is. That's what a form is. Its matter I could take exactly the same matter and I could reconstruct this into something else. So its form would change, but its matter would remain the same. Do you see that? Okay. Now, please keep in mind you can have entire courses on just these terms. So I can just try to give you a snapshot of what it means. Now, things change differently. There are things called substantial changes and things called accidental changes. I didn't write that on the board, but this could be understood pretty simply. I could paint this podium. Would it be different? I mean, it would, that does change it, doesn't it? But is it still a podium? Yes. That is called an accidental change. When something changes, but yet at the same time it remains what it is. Like a human person, me. I used to be very tiny, now I'm medium size at best, okay? But I'm still me. I went through accidental changes. I still remained a human person. I remained me. I remained who I was. But I didn't alter my form. My form was never altered. We could take all of this. Now, a substantial change is when you change something so much that it becomes something different. Its substance has changed. It hasn't just accidentally changed. Its substance has changed. It's become a different idea. Now, does that remotely make some sense? Does that make some sense? So, all about a substance when it undergoes a change. It can go through a substantial change or an accidental change. Matter is constantly in motion. We know that. We just know that physically, that there's some sort of motion to matter. But yet things still seem to remain what they are unless we change them. Unless their very form changes. Now, why do I go into that? And this does have a lot of implications, because most of what I'm going to be discussing is going to be the soul. What I just gave you was a very brief snapshot of what's called hyomorphic metaphysics. It is the metaphysics that the church accepts as really the most accurate. This whole notion of substance, of matter, and of form. There are other kinds of metaphysics that essentially they don't believe in form. They just believe in matter. That everything is physical. That all there is physical entities. But what Aristotle and what Thomas Aquinas maintain is there's something quite real. There's an idea. There's a unity united with matter. That's different than the matter itself, or else we would not understand what it is. We understand this as a podium. We can name so many different things. Things can change their form. That there's something real. There's something quite spiritual, actually, to reality. That this is really the spiritual aspect of reality. Forms, ideas. A lot of modern metaphysics rejects this idea. But the reason why I go into this is because of this. The church recognizes the matter and the form of the human person as this. Now try to think about that for a second. The matter of the human person is the body. That's what we're made out of. The form, our very form, the idea of what we are, is the soul. Soul is what maintains the unity in anything. In anything. But it's really quite a mystery. You ask biologists, and we're going to go into this understanding of what is life. There is no accurate explanation that science has given why some things can be alive and some things are not. Because a lot of the same elements in this are in here. And yet I'm alive and I can do a lot of different things, and this is inanimate. Inanimate means without soul. Did you know that? Okay, so a lot of this philosophy it all fits together. An inanimate object. Animus means soul. In Latin means not. You have souled things and non-souled things. I mean, just take into consideration something like a tree. Just something at a fairly low level of life. There's an absolute unity to a tree. There's an absolute way that it receives nutrition. There are laws to the way that it grows. There are laws to the way that it produces itself. There are absolute and definite poisons that will affect its life detrimentally. We know that, but it remains a tree. It has a certain form, or matter. It's made out of stuff, but its form is a tree. Now, when something dies, what happens to something when something, a tree or a person? What happens to us when we die?
Okay.
But what do both of those have in common?
Decompose.
Yeah, decay, decomposure. It falls apart into its various components of matter. Why? Because it's lost its form. It's lost what holds it together. Okay? I mean, these elements, these will be dispersed. I will be in the ground one day, or flying through the air in particles. But what holds me together, what keeps my unity is soul. That's how the church would describe it, that there's a mystery there that's very, very important for us to understand. We actually teach, it's like, okay, do plants have souls? Gianna, do plants have souls? I like to pick on Gianna. Are they alive?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Philosophically speaking, the church doesn't. Everything that is alive has a soul. And now it depends on what you mean by soul. That needs qualification. And I'll try to clean that up when we come back from the break. That's why this hierarchy that I drew for you, the hierarchy of the powers of the soul. And I'll start describing more of this when we come back. That it's not enough to say that we have this form that holds us together called soul. Like, hopefully you understand, at least vaguely, like, okay, I can see basically what you're saying. That's all I really want from you right now. But we want to know more. Well, what is that soul capable of? What does it do? Okay? The answer to the question of what the soul does are its powers. I have a little figure that I drew for you. I created that figure because I couldn't find something on the internet that I thought was accurate enough. I drew it, and Vanya cleaned it up on the computer a lot better than my little kindergarten drawings could do. But that's going to become very important as we look at the different powers of the soul, because we'll see that this has a lot of consequences for our spiritual life and for our moral life, the powers of our soul. Like, I remember when, I had to have been about 23 because Jason was 19. I'll never forget this. I was in the kitchen and I had come in late. And surprise, surprise, I was 19. And so I was coming in late because I was out with my friends. And I remember my dad walking into the kitchen and saying, a tragedy has happened in our family. Your cousin Jason has died in a car accident. And my cousin Jason was, no, he was 19. I was more like 22. That's the difference. And my dad was very, very upset about that. I mean, I was too. I love my cousin Jason, but Jason's father pretty early on more or less left the family, and so my father kind of took Jason as sort of a foster son and really tried to help him along. And so that was very difficult for my father. And I remember the funeral, and my dad, he certainly has has a good bit of faith. I think it's faith has come a little bit more easily for me, though. We have to remember that faith is a gift, and some of us just have more of it than others, and that's okay. Okay, I've always had faith. I was talking about God since I was tiny. I don't know why, but I remember my dad looking at the coffin, and I went up to the coffin, and I was just compelled to say this, and I said, Dad, he just said he's gone. And I said, Dad, exactly. I said, do you see Jason there? And he said, no. And I said, that's because he's not there. This is just what's left of him. Like all of his laughter, everything that he was, everything that he believed, everything that he loved is still alive. It's still there, but it's just not in front of us. All we have in front of us is what's left of him. And it's not even his matter. That's why we call a dead body a corpse. It's not even a body anymore. Not really, because there's nothing that unifies it. The form is left. The forms are undying, particularly the human form. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come back. So when we come back, we'll take a break because it's 1:45, right? And right on schedule. How long is the break? 10 minutes. We'll just take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and go a little bit more into the specific powers of the soul. Okay? One thing I would like to mention, and it does not bother me in the slightest, as far as like the payment is concerned. Some of you are not able to pay the full amount. There's no one who dislikes more asking for money for courses. It's not like it goes to me. I don't see it. But the center is already held up by a great deal of funds from the diocese, and the appeal covers. I forgot the. Do you know how much it is? Is it 15,000? Huh?
Has been increased to 20,000 this year.
Been increased to 20,000.
Yeah.
Okay, but the money does help. Everyone has not been able to pay the full amount, so I'm simply asking those of you that might possibly be able to pay some more, could you please do so? I will pay some myself for a couple of people, which is fine. It doesn't bother me. Some of us are doing better with those material gifts than others, so if you're able to share that, that would certainly be very appreciated. Okay, so far my voice is.
It's better?
Okay, it's okay. It's holding its own. Now, come on. The powers of the soul. According to, I'd like to read you, this is the Catechism number 17. 1700, excuse me. The dignity of the human person is rooted in his creation in the image and likeness of God. It is fulfilled in his vocation to divine beatitude. It is essential to a human being freely to direct himself to this fulfillment. By deliberate actions, the human person does or does not conform to the good promised by God and attested by moral conscience. Human beings make their own contribution to their interior growth. They make their whole sentient and spiritual lives into means of this growth. Now, some of those words in there, what I want to call your attention to is this notion in the Catechism that everything within us, all of our interior growth, that we're responsible for that. But the Catechism starts using words like sentient. What's going on there? Okay, if you take a look at your diagram, you'll see sensitive. I think that's the word I used. The sensitive appetite. When we're talking about the soul, what is this diagram essentially? This diagram is essentially 5 ways of being alive. That's what our powers of soul are. Their abilities. 5 ways of being alive. Starting from the bottom, being the least complex, and going to the top, being the most complex. At the bottom, where we know that there are things that exist on merely a vegetative level, right? Just literally vegetation. All that they're capable of doing is having the abilities of like nutrition, growth, reproduction. That's all plant life. Slightly more complex than this is the ability to move. Now, this is slightly between animal life and vegetative life because, in fact, there are some plants that have the ability to move themselves. We have found that some of them can actually move around. They have some abilities for that. Where we're starting to get more complex is sensitive life. Those beings that are capable of having senses, which are what? Animals, right? Now, do we share that with them? Of course we do. There's sensitive life. Now, the difference, and there are also these things called interior senses. We're going to learn about that a little bit more next week. Namely memory, imagination, an estimative power, and a common sense power. There are exterior senses, in other words, senses that enable me to receive information from the outside and for me to compute it inside. But there's also interior senses. Those interior senses help me to make sense of what I have received from the outside world. And even animals share many of these abilities. Okay? So, again, this is a way of being alive. This is a way of being alive. This is a way of being alive. A little bit higher than that, we get the appetitive. Now, that's, again, another $10 word. Appetitive just means of or relating to the appetite. And appetite meaning your will. Your ability to choose, your ability to desire, your ability to wish or to act. Okay, that is what your appetitive ability is. To do stuff, to tend towards something, to want something, to desire something and then to go and get it. Okay, that is your appetitive power. And we know that it's different than our rational powers because there's a lot of things that I would like to do that I don't do, right? They have to be different. Otherwise, those two things would be absolutely unified. And then, of course, at the highest level, we have our rationality, which you can see split here in speculative and practical. I'll explain again that more in detail. We'll go in more detail with some of these powers in our other classes. This is more kind of an intro class to give you some terminology. Now, just simply our ability to think, our ability to take in, our ability to understand abstract concepts like justice, love, okay, nobility, plus our ability to look at information in front of us and make decisions. We have to prudently weigh, well, should I do this? Should I do that? We're using our rationality, of course, when we're using our intellect when we do that. Now, that might be all fine and dandy, but there's a lot more going on here than you might imagine. you will notice for those beings that are up here, namely a human being, we have this power, but we have everything beneath. Right? I mean, that's why I constructed that as a bit of a pyramid. Okay. There are some things that they stop here. There's other things, namely animals, that will stop here. They have some sense of appetition, but it really stops there. Because human beings, we are like angels, but we are animals. Now, this is where a lot of this theology, it becomes so terribly beautiful whenever we start studying all of it. Because there are other beings, human beings, we have all of these. We are absolutely unique in God's creation. That we are both immortal, we have the mind that is somewhat, at least somewhat angelic, and yet we're animals. Which is very, very frustrating. Super frustrating. To be an immortal being, we will never die, ultimately. We'll go through one death, but we're going to continue on, right? And yet have to get sick, okay, and go through all of the things that we have to go through to take care of what St. Francis called brother ass, his body. That's what St. Francis called his body. Okay, because he considered his body stubborn and difficult to take care of. Okay. I don't know if you've ever heard that. Okay. Brother ass. Take a look at it. Now, I know there are children in the room, but hey, St. Francis said it. It's not me.
They're all writing it down.
Yeah, look. Father Basil said St. Francis said it. I know. But here's one interesting thing as we take a look at this philosophy or this theology. Is it not possible that there could be beings that have only this and not that? That's the definition of an angel. Okay. That's the definition of an angel. Or that is, in other words, the reality of an angel. They don't have to deal in the same way with bodily nature. They are pure rationality and pure will. And we'll try to talk a little bit more about that as we go. Five different ways of being alive. And we can see, if you start looking at moral theology, if you start looking at the catechism, you are going to see this language of appetition, sensitive appetite, bodiliness, matter, form. You're going to start seeing these words more and more, and hopefully they will start making a little bit more sense to you. For example, where is one key and privileged place that we hear the phrase matter and form and substance? Can you remember another key place where you've heard those two words? Mass. Okay, try to be more specific. You're right. Consecration. It's the Eucharist, right? That this is the philosophy that's used to explain the privileged sacrament of our faith. What do we call the Eucharist? Is transubstantiation. Isn't that shocking? Transubstantiation. In other words, changing the substance of what is there. Okay, the church is using this language. What does the church mean by that? What is the matter? What is the matter with Eucharist? What's the matter with Eucharist? Nothing is the matter with Eucharist. What are we dealing with? Bread and wine, right? But before transubstantiation, we have bread and wine. After, we have what? What has changed? There's a different form. Okay, the substance has been altered. Okay, with those people that when they get caught up with, they get caught up when we hear this word matter. We're not talking about atoms and molecules here. When we understand that bread and wine have been changed into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, think about it this way. Are atoms made up of matter? This is philosophical matter. Yes. It's a something, isn't it? So an atom and a molecule has to be made of something. Even the molecules, the very atoms, are altered into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Everything is altered. Now I know this can be slightly mind-blowing, okay, but what I want you to understand is that this language is used constantly in many different ways in our church, okay? So if we just start to understand some of the terms, I'm not just writing these up here like, oh, well, these are two terms that Thomas Aquinas taught us, 700 years ago. No, they're used all the time to describe sacraments, to describe morality, to describe all sorts of things. They're still in our catechism over and over and over and over again. Okay, so I'm not just teaching you ancient stuff. I'm teaching you stuff that we still use. Father Jack wanted me to complete this equation. He's like, will you please complete this equation? This is driving me crazy. Okay, so I can complete this equation. Okay, on the level of a human being, what body plus soul ends up equaling is person. The definition of a person in the Catholic Church is an individual substance of a rational nature. An individual substance of a rational nature, composed of body, which makes us different than angels, who are pure spirit, okay? So the whole thing like, oh, angels have wings. That's a pet peeve of mine. Just a pet peeve. They do not have wings. Because a wing is a part of a body. And angels don't have bodies. So, now, does that mean that they can't manifest themselves as whatever the heck they want to manifest themselves? Of course they can. Of course they can. They have immense power, and they have manifested themselves that way before. But for us to try to understand what a purely spiritual being is, pure spirit, is something beyond our ability to conceive of. Because when we conceive of something, it has to be, we have to conceive substances, don't we? Things. When we imagine something, well, we have to have something to imagine. But an angel is pure spirit. The immense power of that is mind-boggling, But what we know that the Lord himself has told us, it's Mark chapter 12. He was asked, "Teacher, which is the first commandment of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." Heart, soul, mind, strength. Okay? With everything in you. And it's interesting if you really start breaking down those words, you're starting to break down, okay, what's everything in us? This is everything in us. So in order to fulfill this commandment, for us to understand, okay, if I'm supposed to love the Lord with all my mind, certainly, all my heart, usually associated with our ability to decide, okay, all of our strength, that comes from the sensitive appetite, okay, that, in other words, this is a rational explanation of what Jesus is talking about. How can I fulfill what Jesus is talking about unless I have a language to understand it? Well, again, unless I know what is in there. And we're going to go through some specific powers, and I'll even make some recommendations about, okay, with mind, with will, with imagination, sense, emotions, even what are some practical things that I can do to strengthen those powers, is where I want to go in the future. Right now, it's just, again, kind of throwing some stuff out as an intro to just get our feet wet. According to Thomas Aquinas, and this is moral theology, ultimately we are intellectual beings. When I say intellectual, and when Thomas Aquinas says intellectual, he means what it means to be a rational being. In other words, he's not just talking about thought. He's talking about heart, too. He's talking about, in other words, just an intellectual being. Don't just think of one big brain like Spock or something. That's not what we're talking about. That our minds should rule our actions like a benevolent monarch is one thing that Thomas says. That we should... These powers, I don't know if you know this, but particularly like sensitive, because this is where a lot of our emotions will come from, sensitive and the lower levels of our appetite, we can be really difficult to rule, can't we? Can you always make your body do what you want it to do? I can't. If you figured out how to do that, please let me know. Or even just on the level of good things, habits that we want to form. It's like, well, I want to get up every morning at 7 a.m. and I want to say my rosary. Has anybody ever failed in trying to do a new resolution? All the time. Okay. I mean, St. Paul, this is what he said, the good that I know, I do not do. He talks about that in Romans 8, right? That in other words, the Lord created this to be an absolute unity. Absolute unity. Each power cooperating with the other. Existing in absolute unity. What happened? The fall happened. And all of a sudden, all of these parts started arguing with each other. That is the reality that we have now. That these parts, if you want to call them parts, in a way that they are parts, no longer cooperate with each other. This is what the church is talking about when she uses words like, well, concupiscence. That our desires, our thoughts, they start to run away with us now. They're a bit unruly. And part of our moral life, and certainly what the Lord came to do, is to pay the price for all of the damage that we've caused by all of this going awry. He did that for us. But also through the sacraments to try to get us to unify again. To try to get all these parts to cooperate with each other again. That's what the power of the sacraments and the example of the saints whom we celebrate today are supposed to do. To get all of those parts to cooperate. Now, when you have, if you want to know the difference between just a weak person and a truly evil person, for example, like a lot of most people are good. What I've constantly come in contact with is, even with a lot of the terrible mistakes we make, often is made by very good people, but we're weak, we're fragile, we let each other down, for many different reasons, okay? But there's a goodness there. And that's because these parts don't really cooperate. Where a truly evil person comes in is when you get somebody who decides to make all of these parts cooperate, but cooperate at complete service to themselves. Now that's where you get something evil, rather than just weak or fragile. Okay? All of us are weak and fragile. I would certainly hesitate to say that none of us are evil. I doubt that you'd be sitting in a class about Thomas Aquinas. It's like, how can I wreck the class on Thomas Aquinas? Yeah. Okay, well.
Father,
You have to pay extra.
what would be an example of evil then? Like an example of that, or of just for yourself? So wanting that for yourself.
Well, if you have, just take a very classic example of someone like Hitler, who decides that Jews are wicked and evil and then acts to destroy them, in other words, marshals all of their internal abilities to serve an evil end. But then because what we're ultimately dealing with, and we'll talk about this more certainly when we talk about the will, is we're existing in a realm of freedom. We are able to make real choices. We are not determined by matter. Matter is determined by matter. Now this is logical, okay? Matter determines matter. We have a nature beyond the animal, which means that we can decide to act according to our nature or against it. Okay, can a lion wake up and decide that he's not going to act like a lion that day? No. He exists only on the level of instinct. Now, there's a certain complexity involved with his behavior, but there's no real freedom there. His actions are more or less determined by matter. By matter. But because we are also spiritual beings, okay, with these powers above this one, ideas are not constrained by matter. We have true freedom. We can decide our fate. But here's the thing, and this is what we'll discover with some of these, just going through some of these powers, that how much in control of yourself really are you is a very, very important question to ask yourself. If ultimately our fate, our destiny is to give ourselves as a gift to God and to others, which really it is. That's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what charity is, ultimately. That's what love is, to give myself and everything that is in me. But what if I'm not in control of whatever is in me? Take the example of an addict. How in control of his or her actions, or at least a certain set of actions, is an addict? Their actions have been taken control of by this sickness called an addiction. So they have less and less freedom less freedom to truly be who they're supposed to be, to truly become the image of God that they're supposed to become. This sort of lack of freedom can exist on really all the levels. It can exist in our mind as well. We can have certain ideas, we can have certain lies lodged in the mind. You can say you have an individual who simply refuses to forgive their parents for something, for example. They just live locked in by the lack of forgiveness and by resentment. Do you not think that that is going to affect the entire hierarchy? Of course it will. And that there's the more that we don't act in alignment with God's laws, the less freedom we have. John Paul II is pretty famous for saying freedom is not meant to do what we want to do, but for what we ought to do. Freedom is not for what we want to do, but for what we ought to do. And ironically, that's when we experience the most freedom of all. That's why Scripture refers in multiple places to being a slave of sin. That, we'll have some people say, well, you're enslaved by the moral laws that you follow. We in fact find precisely the opposite, that we're set free by the laws that we follow. We are not in control of ourselves when we allow sin to break apart our nature. It's just as we go into our class a little bit more, I'm going to be talking more specifically about particular powers. I want to just spend a few minutes mentioning some of the virtues before we close that you will find, and these are just a few virtues. I've given you some notes. Now this is from the Catechism, and there's more in the Catechism written about these virtues if you want to get the full story. But what we call the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. They are among some of the most important. They are not all of the virtues. This does not exhaust the virtues, because we have virtues that would be the opposite of each of the 7 deadly sins, for example. Like we have lust, well, it would be the opposite of that, well, purity. Okay, anger, well, you would have somebody who's like gentle and peaceable. So there are other virtues. But just notice a few things that I just want to bring your attention to. Prudence is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. Okay, in other words, we see this word reason, rational. This virtue matches with a certain power. In other words, what are the virtues? The virtues are excellences of these powers. That's what virtues are. In other words, when these powers, particularly these 2, but also this one, and we're trying to control these 2, okay, because we take these for granted, okay, that what virtues are is when we're using these powers well, they express themselves as virtues. And we see this language in our catechism. We see, like, for justice. Justice is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm, what? Will. Oh, surprise, surprise. Justice actually is a virtue of this power. Justice is actually a virtue of this power, the will. To pretty much to give my neighbor what is his due, to weigh the good versus the bad, and to choose what is best. Fortitude, moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in pursuit of the good. You'll notice if you read on, it strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and to overcome obstacles in the moral life. Now, if you notice, just very briefly, and I'll go through this again when we talk about it more particularly, with the appetitive soul, if you see those two words on the top, concupiscible and irascible, more $10 words. In other words, there's a certain virtue, the irascible, that has to do with fighting evil and fleeing what is bad. That's a particular part of our soul. And that's what fortitude is about. It's really strengthening that part. Fortitude, in other words, is a virtue of that particular part of the soul, of really trying to last through the bad times. Okay, so I'm just trying to show you that what I'm trying to depict here with the powers of the soul matches the information that you read in our tradition. That's what I'm trying to show you. Okay. Temperance, the moral virtue that moderates the attraction of pleasures and provides balance in the use of created goods. Temperance, and now we're looking at sensitive appetite now, right? You got to control that sucker. Okay, all the sensitive appetites, like, okay, Vanya just made me these. Okay, now I got to control myself or I'm going to get sick, okay? Sicker. But in other words, that temperance is a virtue of controlling that particular part of the soul. And that all of these things fit together in a wonderful harmony. That the church is not random when she just comes up with this language. That it all fits together in a perfectly ordered structure. And a language that we use, a language that is in large part given to us by Thomas Aquinas. And we'll spend the next 3 classes taking particular parts of the soul and trying to learn how those particular parts work, what the virtues of those parts are, and how to strengthen those particular parts in our spiritual life. So, thank you. Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
Yes.
Good job.
The word, but did you have a question?
Oh, it was just a comment about the desires of your heart, like how often do you hear in our world today to follow the desires of your heart, right? And in temperance it's saying, do not follow your inclinations.
Yeah, do not
Do
follow.
not follow the desires of your
Well, I've asked this question before. If from this point forward, if you did only what you wanted to do, how successful of a life do you think you would have? I wouldn't get out of bed. Okay. I mean, just, we have to, there's some discipline, there's some control that has to take place. And ultimately, and of course, the one power, and this is, I thought that this was quite interesting. I took a look at conscience, for example, because the church uses the word conscience. And I was thinking, okay, well, what part of the soul is that? That was, as a philosopher, that was my question. And as I was reading the evidence and the catechism, and you can take a look at it yourself, it starts with number 1776. that the conscience, very interestingly, is kind of a synthesis of all of Him, according to what the church says. Not only is the conscience that, it's also a voice from the outside. It's also the voice of the Holy Spirit speaking to the unity of the human person about the right course of action or about what you really should do. But here's the thing, if we're not, or the less unified we are, the less disciplined we are with those virtues, the less we're going to be able to hear that voice. Right? I mean, that's not just me saying that, that's the teaching of the church. But if we're just listening to our voice and we're listening just to the voice of the world, that's going to drown out the voice, the authentic voice of conscience. Because we might just, oh, well, my conscience is saying this. Like, well, was it your conscience, or is that just your selfishness talking?
Or how we deceive ourselves.
Or how we exactly, how we deceive ourselves.
They also talk about a well-formed conscience.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's part of the whole thing, is understanding. I mean, our minds have to be, we have to learn correct information, but also, of course, what's happened to our heart, what's happened to us in the past, affects how we understand certain moral actions. And all of those, I mean, the Catechism clearly says the proper formation of one's conscience is a lifelong endeavor. It's not just something that you're finished with. We're still doing it. We're still doing it. I think I'm just about done. But is there any other comments or questions? Chelsea?
I have a burning question. I don't want to ask it.
Oh. Yes.
I'll just wait.
You just want to wait?
Yeah, I don't want to ask it.
Okay.
Everybody.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. And I hope we can continue with just getting deeper into these things.
Thank you.